So I've tied together some disparate strands of previous research, and I'll sort of explain. Another thing I try not to do in a presentation is a biographical approach, but I think it helpful here as I go along that I will say something about how I came to this area, because I think that'll be informative as to understanding what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to accomplish. I'll get to it, bear with me. There we go. So the existing sort of branches of research that I'm working with involve particularly sport for development, which is where I've taken my work recently. I have a background in communications and journalism. I practiced in media law, and I've been interested in the problem of how can communications, freedom of expression, these values serve the interests of development. But moving my work in that way, I happen to be working with a colleague who's my mentee on the 10-year track, who I tremendously admire, who's been doing work in LGBT rights. And so he has given me an interest in that work. And I've dabbled a little bit in it with his guidance. And lately, I myself am a Christian, and I've seen some trend in Christian evangelism that I'm not real happy about. And I'll come to that in a moment. And that obviously sparked my interest because I work with youth in the church, and I want to make sure they're on the right track, put it that way. So this is all to an end of uniting this research in the interest of development and looking particularly at the case of Uganda, which, again, begging your indulgence, I'll explain why Uganda a little bit later. Particularly with the U.S. audience, I imagine a little less here. It's necessary to give a lot of background about Uganda, starting with the fact that it's in Africa. But I'm going to take some things for granted here, and I'll go over it rather quickly. But you probably well realize that there is a profound Christian influence in Uganda. And there are many reasons for that historically, but it is a significant force today, this being religious statistics, and this actually an ethnographic map, because there is some historical correlation. And that, what I set out to do initially, because the place in this research where I was really not well educated, not well informed, and why I was attracted to the Africa CRN initially within Law and Society, was to understand why that is, because it strikes me as very peculiar. I mean, the growth of Christianity in Uganda is something that occurs over basically 150 years. In the history of Christianity, that's really fast, right? That's a really short time frame. And so trying to dig through that history and read a bunch of brown and brittle books in my library about how that could be, I came to understand a good deal of it. And it has to do with some things that are universal to East Africa, some are particular to the peoples whom Uganda comprises. But essentially, there were fantastic cultural conditions, this confluence of circumstances, cultural, political, social, that allowed the flourishing of Christian evangelism at just the right time. And some of these factors came from the state of African traditional religion and its belief system and where it was when the British came, when the British and the French came. And I trace in my paper, I trace that history a bit, trying to highlight the aspects of the successful missionary enterprise as will relate to where I'm going later in the 20th century and 21st century research. It's a little slow, but here we go. Particularly then, again, very grossly tracing this history, but when the British finally get the ball rolling, the European political process also was in kind of just the right place, socially, culturally, politically, in order to push this agenda. In Uganda, you had this intense competition between the missionary society and the white fathers of the Catholic Church. And you had the British imperialist desire to control the area, to control the source of the Nile, and thereby and found that this was facilitated by setting up this unusual sub-imperial governmental structure, which incidentally allowed the missionaries to continue to work on the ground and win the hearts and minds. And so it was, again, just this remarkable creation of circumstances, and particularly two aspects here. The northern alienation, as I put it, missionaries not reaching the far north, which would have repercussions well into the Amin era in the 20th century, and also the kind of lock between missionary work and education at the local level that would come to be such a profound cultural influence. So kind of glossing over the next 150 years, when I start to look at the Obote to somewhat lesser extent, but in particularly just looking at the Amin era, and me being, by my background, focused a bit on communications, you see this really remarkable language in connection with Amin. His ousting of Obote and coming into power is called by the British a resurrection. Papers refer to him as savior, redeemer, and all the while, he's on this campaign of Islamicization and expulsion of Christianity. But that, of course, was never important to Amin. Amin was more into drugs and pornography than Islam, and so it was really about, strategy. It was about political power play and using that religious force to his advantage. And then, again, sort of glossing over some intermediate years and of Obote returning and so on, being expelled, but going on to the Museveni regime, which continues now. You see kind of the same strategies. Museveni, perhaps with a bit more benevolence, but using this tool of this almost the same as the British sub-imperial system, this use of the religious power to his ends. And the Lord's Resistance Army emerges in the north, and while they might be an enemy, it really accomplishes the same goals through the same means. It's an exploitation of that religious force again. And then the emergence of the AICs and the PCCs is another small piece of this. Now I'm ahead of my notes, so I've got to make sure I keep up. So, is that coming? It's coming, yes. So getting on to sort of LGBT history in parallel to this in Uganda, and again, I'm going to talk about Uganda, but there are generalizations to be made to East Africa and further. There was not historically, as you all probably well know better than an American audience might, there was not a pathologization of homosexuality. That was a missionary product. And the traditional view toward homosexuality was more of what we call today in the United States the don't ask, don't tell policy. The figure of Mwanga II is rather interesting because although he in the 1880s had this harsh campaign against the missionaries, he was probably, historical accounts are fairly clear, bisexual or gay. And that actually caused a great tension with him and missionaries because that wasn't what the missionaries thought, oh, here's Africa, it's pure and free of the homosexuality that represents our corruption back home. Of course, that was ridiculous. And Mwanga was proof of the fact that that was ridiculous. And so they didn't care for that. But the modern view, which looks more like what we'd be familiar with, of homophobia and modern view toward LGBT today, we might recognize in Uganda, really comes from about 2009 with this great American export, I'm being sarcastic, this American export, Scott Lively. And this at last, is why I took a particular interest in Uganda. Scott Lively comes from Massachusetts, where I'm at the University of Massachusetts. So, sorry about that. He is an interesting person, and I wish to be charitable to him. Thank you. But I will say right now I'm following a fascinating civil suit you might or might not know of in Massachusetts against Scott Lively for, the newspapers say, for crimes against humanity. It's really just it's a civil tort suit, but it's based on his facilitation of the suppression of human rights in Uganda for having gone to Uganda and brought and worked on anti-homosexual, anti-LGBT community legislation. And I think that suit will fail. I'm sorry if I can offer you the unfortunate prediction, but it's fascinating theory, and it definitely has garnered a good deal of attention. Lively, I mean, you probably heard of the fellow or heard of his work, but not many don't know that his first big splash was 1995 with this book, The Pink Swastika, in which he described how Nazism and Hitler was actually a secret effort to propagate homosexuality around the world. It was not. There's a 1988 book by a fellow named Plant, which is very good at showing the persecution of homosexuality by Nazism, in case you were unclear on the point. But that's who we're dealing with, and he was instrumental. I mean, certainly not exclusive, but instrumental in the famous anti-homosexuality bill in 2009, and then the bill that was enacted in 2013, less the death penalty, at least, which is quite a remarkable piece of legislation throughout the world, never mind to Africa. And there's David Bahati, the MP, who was a critical mover in that direction. That legislation is temporarily thrown out and tied up in litigation, but it's thrown out on procedural grounds, not substantive grounds. But it's always a threat. And there is this culture of persecution, which has emerged around this legislation and this lively effect since 2009. Fabulous documentaries. I'm trying to figure out right now a way to justify showing Call Me Kuchu to my first year class this year, and I'll find it because it's one of those things that's like I think every human being should watch. 2012 and 2013, God Loves Uganda actually got a good deal more press in the United States, but I think is good, but not as good as Call Me Kuchu. They document various awful events, the murder of David Kato, and the sort of mass outings in the media, again, of interest to me as a communications person. And one of the men supposedly pictured in here is Chris Mubiri, who's a football manager in Kampala. And so that's of interest to me in the intersection of the sport world with this LGBT rights issue. So all these conditions historically that led to the thriving evangelical mission in Uganda are also serving to perpetuate the lively anti-LGBT agenda today. And again, of my interest in particular as a free expression person, I'm struck by the sort of perverse but fascinating argument today that Museveni makes and says, I would love to do something about those awful newspapers, but the freedom of expression is so important. I learned that from the West. And I think, wow, that's really right, and yet not. And I think that's going to be the hook, by the way, which I get my first years to watch that movie. Because that's a really interesting problem in privacy law, is the punishment of truthful information lawfully obtained and subsequently disclosed. So you're probably wondering, gosh, what about that football piece? I'm sorry, I've gotten myself distracted. But the previous work that I did, and I just wrapped up last year, it seems like yesterday, but a good friend, Jose Benavides, and I wrote an article on the World Cup, and using the work of my colleague, Jeremiah Ho, the fellow who does LGBT activism in the United States. And Jeremiah has this great work showing the progressive development of LGBT rights, and how small steps add up to big steps, essentially. It's incrementalism borrowed from the pure social sciences. And what we did was take that incrementalism from Jeremiah and we tried to apply it through sport for development and say that you can make incremental advancements, even with an entity. And I'm so sorry I ran out of time saving football for the end, but football's big in Uganda. Of course it is, because it's the best sport. Stand by. But you can even an entity such as FIFA. You might not have heard of this, but FIFA has this scandal thing going. But even with that going on, you can take the human rights norms in FIFA. You can take the little things. You can take the Say No to Racism campaign, however empty it might really be, and you can and that represents, according to Jeremiah's theory, which we extended, a meaningful small step forward. Almost like Melanie was talking about, this sort of demonstration of normalcy, of acceptability, of tolerance, which can later add up to big steps and later add up to serious advancements. And that in essence, is our theory. And in case you need any more convincing, and then I'll let you go, but even the Pope's behind it. because and I was raised Catholic. I'm now Protestant, but the Pope says, this was at the opening of Brazil World Cup, and of course he's made these statements, which heaven knows are incremental. I mean, the Catholic Church has a long way to go, but has made these statements that are incrementally tolerant of, sort of toward divorce, toward even gay, I don't know, well, let's not say gay marriage yet, but even to being gay, right? That I think send the right signal. And if he sees the potential for sport the same way then that he sees the potential for the Christian message, then perhaps the two can be united in this way to effect real reform. And maybe, again, Uganda is the time and place to do that and use that sport power in a positive way for a change. Thank you.